Bush hid the facts. Let's just compile that. Mr. President, sir, I didn't expect to see down here.
Are you using Notepad to spread lies about me?
No, no.
Are you sure?
I can assure you.
There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, fool me once, shame on you. If fool me, we can't get fooled again.
Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring. In early 2004, it appeared that Microsoft had a problem. By this time, the United States coalition were a year into their invasion of Iraq, and people were starting to question the legitimacy of this war. What was being covered up? Who was lying? Was George W. Bush lying? Now, this wasn't Microsoft's problem per se. They likely had very little to do with the whole thing, but they did have a problem that was connected to it. At some point after seeing a blog post online, someone went to their Windows accessories folder, opened up Notepad, typed Bush hid the facts, and saved it. We're not sure exactly why they did this or who this person specifically was, but when they reopened the file, the text had gone, replaced with garbled characters that couldn't be displayed on screen. Quickly this popped up on Usenet groups, internet forums and email around the world. Hey all, try this. For those of you using Windows, do the following. 1. Open an empty Notepad file. 2. Type Bush hid the facts without the quotes. 3. Save it as whatever you want. 4. Close it and reopen it. Huh, real strange, right? People rapidly started reporting that they had the same results, and this apparent conspiracy spread like wildfire. Not long after, someone reported that if you typed one of the flight numbers from 9/11 using the Wingdings font, you would get this. Similar instructions were given. Open Notepad or MS Word, type in the flight number, i.e. Q33N, Q and N caps only, increase the font to 72, change the font to Wingdings. You will be amazed by the findings. Is it coincidence or what? Seemingly another Microsoft-derived message that must have held deeper meaning, surely. What the hell was going on? Did someone at Microsoft know something we didn't? Did someone at Microsoft hold a grudge against Bush? Or was something weirder going on? Well, it turns out that it was actually something a lot weirder. It was actually David Crumps who on the 27th of February 2004 originally reported on this issue on his self-titled blog. Someone showed me a weird text file today. It was a bat file with copy meu.back, meu.text. When you ran it, it would work, but when you opened it in Notepad there was nothing. So we decided to look a bit into this, and here is something we came up with to create invisible text. Open Notepad and enter abc.back, abc.txt. That is space abc.bak, space abc.txt, no line break without the quotes. Save your file. Notepad picks default ANSI as encoding. Open your file. Notepad seems to open by default in Unicode encoding. Your text is now invisible. As you'll notice, this error doesn't have anything to do with the text string Bush hid the facts. Instead, the text is abc.back, abc.txt, and the error was actually stumbled upon by accident. I fired David a message to see what he recalled, but to him it really was just a run-of-the-mill, inconsequential batch scripting problem, and it was just before he became an intern for Microsoft. He didn't think much about it. It was the fallout that was more significant. You see, the error is down to a fundamental function of Windows called isTextUnicode that Notepad uses to determine the encoding of text files. Every file stored on your hard drive is just a collection of bytes, each byte being 8 bits in length. Each of those bits can be on or off, a 1 or a 0. In the olden days, we just had plain text, otherwise known as ASCII. This was extended to ANSI, or more officially SO IEC 8859, and each character took up exactly 1 byte. 8 bits in each byte gives the potential for 256 permutations, and so ANSI had 256 possible characters. So, if this was the only encoding format, Notepad would look at a file, see the hex code for each byte, and translate it to a character on screen as per ANSI rules. But by the time Windows was knocking about, there was need for more than just ANSI. There are many languages around the world, and a lot of them have their own character sets, so other encoding standards were developed. One of those was Unicode. The development of Unicode dates back to 1987, when Xerox employee Joe Becker, along with Apple employees Lee Collins and Mark Davis, started looking into a universal character set. Various other members would join the group, including from Microsoft, and on the 3rd of January 1991, the first Unicode standard was published. But for Unicode to function, it needed more characters, and so 16 bits were now used for each character, or 2 bytes. This gives 65,536 possible permutations, and enough to include in most languages. This encoding used the UCS2 character set and is now known as UTF-16, but just like Microsoft does, I'll refer to it as Unicode here. So, taking our earlier example, if we open up Notepad and type --abc.back --abc.text and save the file, then reopen it, Notepad has to now determine how the file is encoded and display the appropriate characters on screen. If it assumes ANSI, reading each byte as a character, then we'll get our text file as normal. However, if it decides it is Unicode and uses 2 bytes as each character, then we'll either get invisible text or a bunch of squares most likely. This is because, on this computer at least, Notepad is trying to display characters from a character set that isn't installed. This has a name. It's called Mojibake, and it's a Japanese word with a definition of the gibberish resulting from text being decoded using an unintended encoding method. And it happens more than you realise. From websites to software, Mojibake is pretty common. So, if we go back, create the file and save it again, but this time specify Notepad to save it as Unicode, and then open it again, there's no problem. This is because we're making Notepad specify the encoding using a BOM, or byte order mark, which is essentially a marker in the file to tell a parser what encoding format is being used. But text files don't always have this marker, and so Notepad then falls onto the function isTextUnicode to attempt to guess the encoding. Thankfully, you can be sure that your encoding will be spot on with sponsor Squarespace. Come on, it's easy. Use Blueprint AI or select a template, choose your colors, choose your style, change some text, change your fonts. You can't use Wingdings, but that's probably for the best. See what it looks like in mobile form. Then, when you're live, check out the analytics to see where your visitors are coming from. Then make some changes to ensure they come back. Simply head to Squarespace to get started, then, when you're ready, go to squarespace.com/nostalgianerd to get 10% off a website or domain. isTextUnicode is a Win32 function that has been around since Windows NT 3.5. It was then passed down the NT lineage, including Windows 2000 and XP. The function is different from the hybrid 1632-bit versions of Windows, and so this behaviour won't replicate on those. If we take a look at the Notepad source code, we can see the point at which isTextUnicode is called in an attempt to ascertain whether our file is ANSI or Unicode. isTextUnicode will take a string of text, typically the first 256 bytes of a file, perform some statistical analysis, and then return whether it thinks the file is Unicode or not. In this instance, for whatever reason, it decides that our file is in fact Unicode, and thus Notepad presents it as such, resulting in what we see or don't see depending on your choice of font. On the 24th of March 2004, Microsoft developer Raymond Chen would publish a blog titled "Some Files Come Up Strange in Notepad" in response to David Crump's post, where he explains the various encodings. Then, on the 30th of January 2005, lead Microsoft developer Michael S. Kaplan posted about why I don't like the is_text_unicode API, trying to decode its pitfalls and pointing out that this function was now written some 10 years prior by someone outside of the NLS, or National Language Support Team, a time when there wasn't as much Unicode awareness or acceptance at all, so the fact that it exists is kind of a miracle. Nevertheless, it does sometimes assume Unicode when it's not Unicode. On the 18th of May 2006, someone going by the username Zumba wrote on the Win Customize forum about how you can type the sentence "this app can break" into Notepad. Save it, reopen it, and voila, we have the same problem. Kaplan responded to this with his own blog post, identifying that in this instance, Notepad is actually trying to display a bunch of CJK ideographs. It seems then that is_text_unicode thinks that it's more likely that these characters fit together than the original ANSI characters, which isn't as outlandish as you may think. Now, I went to great pains to dig out the source code, although it's also explained well in FlyTech videos. The algorithm it employs checks the difference between the 2 bytes which would make up a Unicode character. It plots the difference in value of each first character and each second character. Let's take these ones and convert them into decimal to make it easier. So 74 becomes 116, 69 becomes 105, 20 becomes 32 down the left hand column. On the right, 68 is 104, 73 115, and 61 97. Okay, so we start with 116 on the left, and we calculate the difference between 105, which is 11. The difference between 105 and 32 is 73. So we have that column, and then we do the same for the right-hand column. And we do this all the way down. It then adds these values together, and then uses the final numbers to perform a calculation. That is, if the left-hand sum is more than the right-hand sum times 3, then it's Unicode. This kind of makes sense, as Unicode characters will typically have a higher left-hand or low byte value than the right-hand or high byte value, assuming little endian formatting, otherwise it's reversed, but forget about that. So, even if you multiply the right-hand byte value by 3, it will still typically be less, but it's very much not without its flaws, as we can see, and we can easily force this algorithm to guess incorrectly every time simply by limiting the amount of deviance and therefore numerical difference of every even character, which the algorithm will see as the right-hand Unicode byte. Now, you'll probably have noticed that "this app can break" follows the same pattern as "Bush hid the facts," a 4-letter word, 3-letter word, 3-letter word, and a 5-letter word. And it just so happens that this combination also triggers is_text_unicode to return a true value when asked. It doesn't work for every combination of letters following that pattern, and if we add an extra character onto the end of this 18-character sentence, then Notepad will no longer make the mistake either. That's because there is now an extra byte. 19 bytes doesn't fit into the Unicode bracket, as its bytes come in pairs. So is_text_unicode returns false, and Notepad correctly presumes this is an ANSI file. But given what was in the news at the time, all the time, it didn't take long for someone to come up with "Bush hid the facts" and start spreading rumours of this weird, apparent conspiracy. Of course, the vast majority of people on the internet even then weren't developers with a specific knowledge of the is_text_unicode function, and therefore upon seeing such strange behaviour, their instant reaction was to conclude some kind of weird, foul play, and then pass the message on, which led to the Bush hid the facts conspiracy spreading around forums and groups and email for years and years and years. Email back then was the primary transmission method, but it made it onto all sorts of places and even into the press, because of course it did. Hoaxes and conspiracies aside, this clearly wasn't useful behaviour for a Notepad application to have. If you save a file, you kind of want to be able to read it again, and so, by April 2008, Microsoft decided to do something about it. This came in the form of Windows Vista Service Pack 1, where the is-text Unicode calls from Notepad were bolstered with additional checks, and just like that, Bush apparently no longer hid the facts. I mean, Saddam Hussein had been plucked from his hole by now anyway. And the only problem, of course, is that it was Windows Vista, so most people just stuck with XP, and Bush kept hiding the facts, for them at least. The conspiracy kept spreading. That is, until enough posts and email popped up explaining the reality, and then it just kind of fizzled out. The website Hoaxslayer being one of the first. But that doesn't explain the Wingdings issue, which was often shared in the same posts as the Bush hid the facts conspiracy. Now that is a different deal entirely, and honestly even more of a piss take. After September the 11th, an email began circulating claiming that Q33N or Q33NY was the flight number of the first plane to hit the Twin Towers. If you type this into Notepad or anywhere else using the Wingdings font, then it would generate a plane, 2 filing cabinets, a skull and crossbones, and with the added Y, the Star of David. Now this was supposed to represent apparently the strike on 9/11. However, it's driven off the back of a conspiracy theory some 10 years earlier, after the release of Windows 3.1, which came preloaded with the Wingdings font. It was the New York Post who kicked off the controversy with the 1992 front page headline, "Program of Hate. Millions of computers carry secret message that urges death to Jews in New York City." A headline that was clearly going to sell copies of the rag, and it was all because typing NYC using Wingdings would result in this. And the consultant was testing a mailing address use of the program when he noticed the letters NYC had been replaced by a hateful message, a skull and crossbones, the Star of David, and an approving thumbs up symbol. Microsoft strongly denies any hidden message. Others disagree. "There's no way it could be a random coincidence," said Brian Young, a friend of a consultant who does not wish to be named. Apparently the friend of an anonymous programmer who discovered the issue, Brian Young, calculated the odds of the 3 letters of the alphabet being combined with 255 symbols to be less than 1 in a trillion. Less than 1 in a trillion, hey Brian? Good work. This purported anti-Semitic message apparently referencing New York's large Jewish community was nothing more than random placement of glyphs relating to characters. However, it didn't stop the Anti-Defamation League from sending a letter of complaint to Microsoft, or for it from bouncing around in the news for years. Even after the League and other groups concluded there was no malicious intent by Bill's software company. The ever-on-hand Brett Silverberg from Microsoft commented the Wingdings were like Rorschach blots. It probably said more about the person than the symbols. Which, given you could extract meaning from pretty much any words you typed, none is 2 poison signs with a cross, IBM is an open hand, an OK sign, and a bomb, and Millennium, which would do the rounds in 1999, is this, which was interpreted to mean many things. So it's a valid statement to make. A rebuke by PC Computing magazine columnist Penn Jillette quickly did the rounds, correcting the ridiculous claims and odds and penning various tongue-in-cheek comments, including, among other things, "There is so much hate, paranoia and bad math in this whole thing that I quit." Quit, incidentally, comes out as this. "This must mean a plane carrying Christians must be stopped if it's snowing. The odds of obtaining this message by chance are 1 in 4,228,250,625. In an attempt to smooth things over, Microsoft would roll out their Unicode-compatible Wingdings font a few years later in '97, using this now deliberate combination for NYC, something that only brought out the hoaxers once again. How can this be a coincidence now? So, as you'd expect after 9/11, this rumour cropped up again, and Microsoft felt obliged to issue a further statement. We can certainly understand how people would respond with some shock to this apparent issue. We did too when it first came up 9 years ago, and we investigated it thoroughly in partnership with the Anti-Defamation League. The conclusion was that the sequence in the Wingdings character set is coincidental and that there was no malicious intent. In fact, it impacted several software companies at the time and continues to do so. Unfortunately, there was no easy way to fix the problem. We understand that this requires explanation. At the simplest level, Wingdings and Webdings are much like an alphabet of characters and provide thousands of potential combinations from which a person could choose. Changing the character set would create an impact of unknown scale on existing data and code using the affected font. Again, using the example of the alphabet, what would happen to existing documents and applications if we switched around a handful of letters? The likely result is that we would create significant issues for people, cause some unintended humorous moments, and several offensive ones. For that reason, Wingdings has been left unaltered since its inception. Even so, they had no reason to really issue this statement if people only looked at the facts, rather than being reactive knobends. The claim that Q33NY was the flight or tail number of either of the planes that hit the towers was completely fabricated. It was a hoax designed to spread a new conspiracy, a new drama to propagate the web, not that people ever let factual inaccuracy get in their way. Combine it with the very real bug of Bush hid the facts, and you had a rather potent and sinister story pointed against Microsoft, and specifically Bill Gates, because if you're going to throw a conspiracy out there, he is apparently the man. Thankfully, by the end of the decade, things had calmed down. Most people now had a version of Windows that didn't replicate the error, email was no longer the primary method of spreading information, and there was now social media and a whole spate of brand new conspiracies to keep people occupied instead. Hurrah!
Fool me once. Shame on you. It fooled me, we can't get fooled again.
Until next time, I've been Nostalgia Nerd. Toodaloo.
It's fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.